Alright guys, welcome back to the channel. It's Matty here, and welcome back to our weekly meta report for Pokemon TCG Pocket. I normally upload these videos on Monday, as you guys probably know, but I was sick for a while and then I went on vacation, so our upload schedule has been all over the place, but we should be right back to things, and everything should be proceeding as it normally does. So from here on out, everything should be more normal. But anyway guys, let's take a look at the results from the Ursa Days Pocket Weekly this past weekend. It's what we normally do. It's the largest weekly Pokemon TCG Pocket tournament series, and the results this week are actually very interesting. While I was on vacation, I was taking a look at the results of this tournament, and I really was excited to get back, talk about it, and cover everything that we're kind of noticing here in this Triumphant Light metagame. I believe this is the third or fourth Triumphant Light meta tournament, so very interesting. We should be getting rank mode at the end of the month, and then early April, we should be getting some signs of what the next expansion, set is, so should be really exciting. But for now, we're kind of floating here in the middle of this Triumphant Light metagame, and things have really changed a lot over the last few weeks. There's a lot of decks that are doing a lot better than they were early on. There's actually some new archetypes that have kind of emerged as pretty top decks and really substantial results of the last couple weeks. So this tournament should have all of that good stuff. Let's get right into the final standings. So as we see here, these are the decks as they kind of completed at the end of the tournament here. Stis, I believe is how you pronounce this, from Norway, shout out to Norway, was 14-2, and he was playing Weavile and Darkrai EX, got first place in this tournament, topping off both of these Dialga and Arceus decks right here from Indonesia and Japan. Both of these players here getting second and third place. Not a big surprise that Dialga and Arceus was still a top deck of this particular tournament. However, what we notice here is that the results are actually a lot different. We're going to go ahead after we take a look at the top decks, and we'll take a look at the metagame tab, and we'll talk a little bit about why maybe, the results are the way they are and how things are shifting. But for now, a lot less Dialga and Arceus here in the top of the standings than we have seen in previous weeks. Very good to see. Now, there is a lot of fighting decks here, probably, again, because most people in this tournament were probably playing Dialga and Arceus. It probably had the largest meta share. We'll go ahead and take a look at that shortly. But because of that, we probably see a lot of these fighting decks, Lucario and Rampardos, as well as Gallade, the two #1 counters to Arceus. Really all Arceus decks, but particularly Dialga and Arceus. So makes sense that we see a lot of them here at 6th place, 7th place, and 8th place for Lucario and Rampardos. And then we see Gallade here at 9th, Gallade at 11th. Shout out to Tilly, TCG, shout out to Tilly. And then we have a bunch more Rampardos and Lucario here at 15th, 16th, and 18th place, another Gallade at 20. So a lot of fighting here representation in top cut, but we did see an 18 trader Articuno deck and a Turbo Arceus Carnivine deck, some aggro Arceus. I did make a video on this recently here at 5th place. So definitely cementing itself as a pretty significant list. And then we do have a Palkia here at 13th place. We have an Executor and Arceus deck. This is another one that's sort of on the rise. And then we have a Palkia Origin form here at, 21st place. So not a lot of water here at the top of the tournament. There was, of course, Articuno at 4th place, but predominantly fighting, and then, some Dialga and Arceus, with Weavile and Darkrai getting first place, which is actually really interesting to me. We do have a Darkrai and Arceus down here at 22nd place, and if we go down a little bit, we see another Weavile and Darkrai here at 29th place, and then there was a Charizard at 35th. So let's go ahead and take a look at these deck lists, and then we'll talk about them just a little bit. This is going to be the winning deck list here, and this is Sneasel, Weavile, and Darkrai. Now, this real aggressive dark type deck here with Weavile and Darkrai is one of my favorite decks in Pokemon TCG Pocket, and I think it kind of fell to the wayside a little bit originally when this came out in the Spacetime Smackdown format, the last format, because a lot of people were playing Magnezone with Darkrai. It was kind of the #1 way to play Darkrai, and Weavile EX really kind of fell to the wayside. A big reason for that was how popular a lot of the grass-type decks were, and Executor was of last format. They really did sort of dominate, and now Grass is in a much worse position. Magnezone is, again, also in a much worse position, which kind of lets us play the traditional, the actual way that I believe we were meant to play Darkrai EX, which is with Weavile. It's a much more fast-paced, aggressive deck. Weavile is able to do, I believe, 70 damage from turn 1. We do have Darkrai to do additional damage. Now, the one thing that we're not playing in this deck is Dawn. So we're not actually able to get that Scratching Nails attack off on our first turn going second, where we typically would. The combo is you attach to Darkrai, and then you kind of move that energy to Weavile with Dawn, and then you can do that 20 damage from Nightmare Aura, and then also attack for Scratching Nails. It can be a really aggressive strategy early in the game, but we're not actually playing any Dawn in this this deck, and I find that to be very, very interesting. That combo can be very, very good, but I think that this is kind of a telltale sign that that explosive nature of that early Dawn combo is not always the most consistent thing, and Dawn, for the most part, isn't a very useful card in this deck if we're not performing that combo on our first turn to get an early knockout. So not seeing any Dawn in this deck is actually really interesting to me, but I actually think it makes a lot of sense because we're kind of just going maximum consistency here. We have double Cyrus. Cyrus is a very good card in any aggro deck and any fast-paced deck. This is a deck that's not doing really enough damage to one-hit KO a lot of Pokemon, so it's nice to be able to bring those Pokemon back into the active spot with Cyrus. We have Leaf to get those Darkrai's out of the active spot more consistently. I think a very, very good inclusion in this deck. 2 Research, of course, 2 Pokeball, of course, 1 Pokemon Communications. I don't mind 1 Pokecom in this deck. You could maybe swap that out with something else, but that consistency to be able to find that, that evolution Pokemon like Weavile could be really, really good. This is really our best way to do that. 1 potion and 2 Giant Cape. I think Giant Cape is definitely very necessary in this deck. The 1 potion is interesting. It might help us get out of range of a Metallic Turbo if we have Giant Cape and we can pop that potion. 140 HP, that goes to 160. Arceus sits for 130. So yes, potion should get us out of range if we do draw into it early enough to live 1 Metallic Turbo and then have enough HP to live an attack from Arceus. So I do like that quite a bit. And like I said, the 20 damage from Darkrai and then the 1 energy attack cost of Weavile doing 70 damage is pretty substantial. The other cool thing about this deck, and one thing I wanted to mention quickly, is that last format, when people were kind of testing this particular archetype and figuring out how to play it, sometimes people were playing it with Spiritomb, some people were playing it with, what was the other dark type card that people were playing? I honestly kind of forget, but they were playing it with other basic Pokemon to potentially deal some additional damage to set up for the Weavile. But I think most people did realize eventually that it's better to just play Sneasel, Weavile, and Darkrai. Sneasel is actually a pretty decent first turn option, and if we aren't attacking on our second turn, or on our first turn going second rather, then we can just attach to Darkrai EX anyway, and that'll do the chip damage to set up Weavile on the next turn. We don't need that Dawn combo. We'd rather just be a very consistent overall deck, and Sneasel does do guaranteed damage, I believe. I think, or maybe it doesn't do guaranteed damage, but you flip 2 coins, so you have the potential to do a lot of decent damage with Sneasel, and most of the time we are at least getting some damage off with Sneasel. So it kind of acts as that early game attacking option if we are going second, and it's honestly not that bad at all. And then next turn we can go for Weavile, and it just is enough damage, I think, and enough HP with Giant Cape and Potions for us to have enough pace to beat some of those top decks in the format. So playing a deck like this, I think, is actually pretty well positioned. I think that aggressive decks are actually a little bit better now than they were previously. This is a very tempo-heavy format with Arceus and Rampardos and Palkia and Articuno, things like that. But this is really the number one, I kind of think the number one real aggressive archetype, the real turbo deck in the format right now, as opposed to the other kind of top version, which was probably the Arceus and Carnivine. There are some fighting type aggro decks, but for the most part, I think this is the number 1 deck, and I really like it. And then 1 copy of Mars is really interesting as well. I actually think Mars is a pretty good card. I've said it a couple times in previous videos, but I think that people are sleeping on Mars. It's a card that's useful in the late game. We would never really use this card until our opponent has already taken 2 prize cards or 2 points, so they only have 1 point remaining. That oftentimes does happen because we're playing exclusively EX Pokemon in this deck. And then in the late game, a lot of times our opponent is forced to basically have Cyrus for game. You know what I mean? Like, they're going to play Cyrus, bring up an injured Pokemon that already has damage onto it, and that's going to be their win condition. Mars allows us to shuffle our opponent's hand back into their deck, and then they only get 1 card, plus their draw for the turn. But it's basically reducing the chance that they have that Cyrus in the late game, which is oftentimes their win condition. I do think that 1 copy of Mars in a lot of decks is actually really, really good. And again, we also have Darkrai EX to attack with for 80 damage. They're doing very similar damage. Technically, Darkrai does more, and it is an attacking option late in the game, but both of these Pokemon have 140 HP with Giant Cape, with Potion, with Cyrus. It's just a very consistent, aggressive deck, and I actually really, really think it's really well positioned actually in the format right now, and I think it's really quite good. Let's quickly take a look at some of these Dialga and Arceus decks. These are really interesting to me because I just quickly want to see what kind of versions people are playing. Okay, so they're both playing the same deck list here, pretty much, right? Yeah, I don't know. They're in different order for some reason, but yeah, so this is, in my mind, probably the number 1 way that people are playing Dialga and Arceus right now. We're playing the 2-2 Arceus and Dialga, of course, and then we're playing 1 Mew EX as that secondary attacking option, which is an alternate win condition against a lot of decks like Palkia, like Charizard. It's useful really across the board, but just a really consistent alternate win condition to attack with genome hacking to copy our opponent's attack. And then we have Flagrant Flower Garden Shaman, which really is really useful in this deck list with Giant Cape, with the potions. It's basically enough healing healing for us to guarantee that we're able to maybe live in well, not guarantee, but oftentimes live an additional attack. It's interesting though that with Mew EX and Shaman, this deck was still, both of these Arceus decks actually, well, maybe not both of them, but at least none of them beat that Weavile and Darkrai deck, which ended up winning the tournament. So Shaman's really interesting inclusion with Giant Cape with Potion. You wouldn't think that Weavile and Darkrai has enough damage output to really beat something like Arceus and Dialga, but as we've seen, I think that consistency is king, and then we see one copy of Mars as well. So I think this is definitely a trend. One copy of Mars seems to be very, very correct, and I think it's really always worth running unless your deck really has no space, but I think Shaman here, definitely the best bet. Most people are playing the Healing Shaman and then 2 copies of Leaf in case we do lead off with Arceus or any of our other Pokemon to go into Dialga early in the game. So I think that this is very correct. 1 copy of Giovanni as well can be the difference in some KO scenarios with Arceus. So I do like 1 copy of Giovanni. And yeah, I think that this is really kind of the #1 way that we're playing Dialga and Arceus. This deck is a little bit different here. We have 1 Giant Cape and 2 Rocky Helmet, so some additional damage output instead of 2 Giant Capes. Very, very interesting to see some differences here. And then we have 2 copies of Giovanni here as well, whereas this deck was playing Mars, this deck wasn't, which I don't know which one was ranked higher. I think they both had like the same record. But anyway, yeah, Dialga and Arceus has been somewhat figured out in my mind. I think if the format changes and the relevant cards in the format and decks in the format change, then of course we can, edit that list to be a little bit different. But for the most part, I think that the Healing Shaman, 1 copy of Mew EX, and then Leaf is really the core supportive combination here, of course, with the Dialga and Arceus. 1 Giovanni seems correct. I do like Mars, like I said, a pretty common trend, I think, in this particular format. And yeah, I would include Mars in most of our decks. And this is going to be 18 Trainer Articuno. Interesting here that we see 1 copy of Red Card and no copy of Mars. I know I was just talking about Mars, but this player ended up playing Red Card, which is a little bit better in the early game, but less useful in the late game. Overall, Red Card, I think a lot of people don't often feel is that useful, but definitely can be. It's not a bad card. We're playing 18 trainers, so we got to play some trainers in our deck. But for the most part, 18 Trainer Articuno and Palkia, both really good decks. I think a lot of people are moving off of 18 Trainer Palkia in favor of 18 Trainer Articuno, because when we're playing Articuno, or rather, when we're playing Palkia, I think a lot of people would prefer to play sort of the Manaphy Origin Form Palkia, even though I still think that 18 Trainer Palkia is probably a bit better. But similarly, if we're playing Articuno, I think most people just play 18 Trainer Articuno. They're not doing any Origin Form Palkia Manaphy combinations or anything like that. So this is what we get, 18 Trainer Articuno. It kind of typically sees more play than Palkia. It's like the #1 most played 18 Trainer deck, so no surprise to me. When we take a look at the meta share, we'll see how many people were playing Articuno, but no surprise here that it made it here this far into the tournament. And this is going to be our fast-paced turbo Arceus deck, and this one's actually pretty interesting to me. So we're playing 2 Arceus and 2 Carnivine, that's the core of the deck, but we're actually playing both kinds of Rotom. This is the Assault Laser Rotom, which I'll zoom in on it here. Basically, it does 20 damage, but if our opponent has any tool cards attached, it does 50. So it's basically the other way, like it's really one of the only other cards that can do that 50 damage for 1 energy. As a basic Pokemon, we have Skarmory, we have this Rotom, we have Sudowoodo, and then we have Carnivine. So this is basically just an additional option. Let's go back to the deck list here. It's an additional option which kind of functions very similarly to Carnivine. They just have different conditions. Carnivine is the same thing, but it does 50 damage if Arceus is on our bench. So it basically gives us a 3rd Pokemon to lead off with that could potentially do that 50 damage. And then we have the Speed Link Rotom here, which is a free pivot, which is really, really good. And then we have the Sky Support Shaman. So those are kind of 2 cards that allow us to switch out of the active spot a little bit more consistently. We also are playing 1 copy of Leaf, 1 copy of Dawn as well, which is pretty cool to set up this Arceus maybe a little bit quicker. I like this deck a lot. This is very fast-paced, very aggressive Arceus. I made a video on this archetype. I made a video on a little bit of a different list, but I like this list as well. 2 Rocky Helmet, again, kind of playing into that really fast-paced, aggressive nature of the deck. 1 Giovanni, and I really actually kind of like this Assault Laser Rotom, again, because it's colorless. We can fit it into this deck. We're probably just playing Grass Energies in this deck exclusively. And yeah, so it allows us to basically hit for that 50 damage on turn 1, because tool cards are very, very common. Oftentimes our opponent will have tool cards, but yeah, I like this list. 1 Giovanni, 1 Cyrus, 1 Dawn, 1 Leaf, 1 Sabrina. So 1 of basically everything in 1 Pokecom, 2 Rocky Helmet, 1 Giant Cape, Sky Support Shaman to help pivot a little bit easier. Also Speed Link Rotom as a pivot and an alternate KO option to hit a bench Pokemon. I really like this list. I think it's kind of slept on a little bit. I think not many people are playing this type of Arceus deck. Of course, Metal Arceus is probably a bit better, but as we see here, 11-3 Onyx G from Philippines, shout out to him, 5th place with this Turbo Arceus deck. I think it's one of the best aggro decks in the game, which I really, really like. And then let's quickly I said quickly 3 times just then. Let's take a look at the fighting type Lucario and Rampardos deck. And this is kind of pretty standard. I haven't been following like the differences between these deck lists from week to week. This isn't an archetype that I play myself very much, but I do know that it is very, very good. And it has, of course, an exceptional matchup against Arceus and Dialga. So a big reason to play this deck right now. It's probably kind of the #1 performing deck of this format because it is the #1 counter meta deck. So it kind of makes sense. It's really strong across the board. Rampardos is a great Pokemon. This is the Sudowoodo that does 50 damage as well. Marshadow. I really just think Sudowoodo Marshadow combo is one of the best combos to counter Arceus. Rampardos is just really good in general. 130 is a really, really strong number. Boosted by Lucario, that's 150, kind of a sweet spot. And if we do have 2 Lucarios, that is 170. That's enough to KO basically everything in the game. It's just a really, really strong fighting deck. It's got great support in the early game with Sudowoodo and Marshadow, and then into the late game we have Rampardos, and Rampardos has a lot more value as like a stage 2 Pokemon than a lot of other Pokemon do. I think really what we're seeing is a trend of these stage 2 Pokemon. If we go back, is that really the only stage 2 Pokemon that are seeing a lot of play are Gallade and Rampardos. And yes, those are fighting type Pokemon, which is probably the main reason why they're seeing a lot of play. But one thing to notice with Gallade and Rampardos is that they have low energy in their attack cost. So you're basically able to invest in playing these stage 2 Pokemon in your deck where you don't have to attach to them every turn. We can attach to a Hitmonlee early on. We can commit some energies to a Marshadow early on. And then we can also set up that stage 2 Pokemon by attaching later on to it, which I think is actually really, really relevant. So it's another trend that I've noticed, which is kind of interesting, is that yes, of course, these are fighting type Pokemon and they're good against Arceus. A big reason why they're seeing play, but they do have low energy in their attack cost, which I think is pretty relevant. Garchomp is another card that also is a stage 2 fighting Pokemon with low energy in its attack cost, but it just isn't nearly as good in that particular matchup as Gallade and Rampardos. So 1 copy of Mars as well. I love to see it. Rocky Helmet, Hitmonlee. Very, very interesting for sure. Now, the other trend that I wanted to talk about, and if we scroll down a little bit, we might be able to find an example of this deck here. And here it is at 40th place, Robs. Shout out to Robs. This is going to be Gyarados and Palkia. And I kind of assumed that this deck would do a little bit better this week, but I think the high inclusion of the fighting type decks and things like Hitmonlee probably stopped Gyarados from doing tremendously well. But this was a deck that really kind of stormed into the metagame over the last week. I think when people started to play the Origin form Palkia with Palkia EX and Manaphy, that combination, a lot of people thought, well, why don't we just swap out Palkia EX for Gyarados? And the deck functions very, very similarly, except now we have Gyarados EX instead of Palkia, which is better in certain scenarios. With Rampaging Whirlpool does 140, but we don't have to discard all those energies when we attack. So Gyarados is a very, very strong card, and this deck in particular just made a lot of sense to me. I've been saying it since the beginning that I thought that Gyarados was going to be actually a really important card in this format, a really good card in this format. But what we saw was that most people didn't really know, I think, originally the best way to play Gyarados, so it took some time to find kind of the top way to play Gyarados, and I think that this is kind of it right now with that Origin Form Palkia and Manaphy combination. And I have talked about it previously, but I do think that if you're playing Manaphy in a deck, you kind of want to play something like Origin Form Palkia. I know some people have mentioned Regice, which is actually a really, really good card as well. But basically, you want to play a non-EX single prize attacking Pokemon with Manaphy, mostly because Manaphy is really good, but when it goes down, our opponent really only has to take 1 KO on an EX Pokemon and then they win the game. So if we're playing Manaphy, we want to also play something like Origin Form Palkia, so potentially our opponent has to KO Manaphy and then KO Origin Form Palkia to then also have to KO Gyarados. And Origin Form Palkia has 120 HP, so it's not that easy to KO. It is just basically another attacking Pokemon that we can set up pretty easily with Manaphy, and then just sort of force our opponent to go through 3 Pokemon instead of 2. It basically buys us another turn to attack. Zone Smash can do 120, it can take KO, so it's a very relevant combination, and I do think that Gyarados pairs exactly like it should in this particular combination, just like Palkia does. But again, for the most part, I think a lot of people are still on the 18 trader Articuno decks, but I did just want to talk about Gyarados because it didn't play super, super high in this tournament. We'll go back and we'll take a look at the meta share shortly, and then we'll talk about all of that stuff. But I wanted to talk about Gyarados because it was actually pretty relevant currently in the metagame, which I thought was really interesting. And I wanted to cover it at some point, but again, I've been away for a while. But anyway, this is at 13th place, Ryan PK. Rion? I don't know. But this is going to be Palkia with Manaphy and Origin Form Palkia. And this player got, well, it went 10-3. I think they were like 13th place. And here we see the Regice Origin Form Palkia, 2 Manaphy, and only 1 copy of Palkia EX, which I think is pretty interesting as well. I don't think you really need 2 copies of Palkia. It's something kind of to think about when you're kind of talking about like sort of the math and the probability of pulling the Pokemon that you need. Palkia isn't a Pokemon that we necessarily will be attacking with. Technically speaking, it's probably going to be our 3rd attacking option in this deck, our final attacker, but it needs to be on the bench early so that we can, attach those energies with Oceanic Gift to it. So 1 copy of Palkia is interesting. Of course, we're increasing our odds to lead with Manaphy in this deck because we're playing 1 copy of all of the other Pokemon and 1 extra copy of a stage or a non-EX Pokemon with Regice. So it's interesting, right? So basically, Pokeball should allow us to find Palkia pretty easily, hopefully. But for the most part, this deck is actually really, really interesting to me. Also, if we don't find the Palkia, we could just go and attack with Origin Form Palkia and Regice or something like that. Origin Form Palkia does a lot more damage than Regice. I think it's a better card, but interesting to see that Regice did find its way into the top placing Palkia this week. I don't know if I would have put too much weight into it, but very interesting to see the count, the Pokemon count in this particular deck list here. A lot of different trainers, 1 Irida, 1 Sabrina, 1 Cyrus, 2 Leaf. Again, I think that Leaf is proving to be one of the most impactful cards in the game. I think that leading with the correct Pokemon is super relevant in the Pokemon Pocket in general, but especially in this format. So playing 2 copies of Leaf does give us that option to retreat out for free early on to go into our leadoff Pokemon, whether that's Dialga or Manaphy or whatever else we're playing, right? So I really like Leaf. And then 1 copy of Mars as well. Again, another trend here. I think 1 copy of Mars is correct in a lot of different deck lists here. 1 Rocky Helmet, 2 Giant Cape. There's so many different ways that we can play these water decks, that we can play Gyarados, we can play Palkia, we can play Articuno. But those really are kind of the 2, I would say, the most significant packages, right? You're either playing 18 Trainer, which is its own thing that some people really are against and don't love playing. But if we're not playing 18 Trainer Water, we're probably playing that Manaphy Origin Form Palkia combination, which I think does pair a little bit better with Palkia and Gyarados, but if we're playing 18 Trainer, I think it pairs a little bit better with Articuno. That's just my opinion. So let's go down a little bit, and then we'll quickly move over to the meta share in a little bit, but this is going to be pure grass Arceus, and very similar to the other kind of aggressive Arceus deck that we saw before, except now instead of playing like the Rotom and the Shaman and things like that, we're just playing Executor and we're playing Leaf. So Executor has proven to be still a very relevant card in the format. If we're playing Cardivine, it does make sense to maybe also play Executor. They're both really strong aggressive cards. Cardivine is a bit better when we're going second. Executor, the best card in the game, probably when we're going first. So it makes a lot of sense. We have strong leadoff options going first and second, and then we can retreat out with Leaf if we do lead off with Arceus. So pretty relevant to keep that in mind. I would maybe try to squeeze in a Pokemon Communications in the stack to find that Executor a little bit more consistently, but this player wasn't playing that. 1 Sabrina, 1 Cyrus, 1 Erica, 2 Leaf, 1 Giovanni, 2 Giant Cape, and Pokeball. So I think that the Giant Cape, Erica, Executor combination is actually pretty relevant because Executor has so much HP. Giant Cape brings it to 180. We can also heal with Erica's. It does put us out of range, I believe, of like 2 Metallic Turbos and then an attack from Arceus, right? It's 160, 190. So yeah, technically that combination, if we get in Erica early enough, it really stops our opponent from even being able to KO our Executor with 3 attacks of that kind of combination. So it's actually pretty relevant. Again, Cardivine, not a bad leadoff either, and then we can hit for 130 with Arceus as well. I really like this list. I think that this is by far the best way to play grass, like pure grass right now. I think Executor is still the best grass type card. It's just found its way in a different type of deck, and of course paired with Arceus like most of the top decks in this format are. I really like this list. In fact, I think it probably should see a little bit more play, but really interesting, and it's actually really refreshing to see probably 5, 6, 7, or 8 decks that are all, I think, at the top of the metagame and are all really substantial. Lastly, let's quickly take a look at this Darkrai and Arceus deck, which has seen a little bit of play here and there. I think that the format has shifted a little bit, but it does make sense that this deck did still place fairly well, and this is going to be Crobat, Arceus, and Darkrai. It's a very significant deck. I think it's pretty good. We see 1 copy of Mars as well. I just think that decks like this are playing a little bit, maybe too much Pokemon for me to consider them really, top decks of the format. I think right now, decks that are playing kind of that sweet spot of like 4, 6, and then like 8 maximum Pokemon, which this deck's playing like 10, I think, which is a lot. That's kind of the sweet spot. We don't want to play too many Pokemon, whereas last format with Pokemon Communications and stuff, it really was like just throw a bunch of Pokemon in your deck and you're probably going to do pretty good. But in this format, I do think that playing less Pokemon is probably best. Just strong leadoffs, I think, are more important. This deck doesn't really have a strong leadoff. That's really the only downside to it, but it is exceptionally strong in the late game with the Crobat. Cunning Link damage, plus Arceus' attack, plus Nightmare Aura. It's a lot of damage in the late game if it gets set up, just a little bit inconsistent in the early game. And for that reason, I wouldn't really consider this deck a top tier deck, but it is still one of like the top 10 decks in the format in my mind for sure. But interesting for sure, and that's kind of really it. There was a Charizard here quickly. We can take a look at Charizard. I don't think much has changed here. We do see one copy of Blue, Potion, and Giant Cape, which is all pretty interesting, but I think it's relevant to allow our Moltres to live for an additional turn, which is kind of going to make or break our ability to win with Charizard. But yeah, interesting. I don't think Charizard's really that bad. I think that it doesn't do super well against a lot of decks in the format, but it always has that potential. I think people are at this point just a little bit bored of Charizard, which is probably why we're seeing it see a little bit less play as time goes on. And then if we go down here to 45th place, I guess this will be the last deck we take a look at, which is going to be Turbo Arceus, but now we've just thrown in Magnezone. So a deck like this isn't bad. Magnezone isn't a bad card. I know it fell out of favor a lot. That 110 damage just really doesn't do what it needs to do anymore. But I think combined with Carnivine and Arceus, it's actually fairly relevant. That early damage from Carnivine plus the Thunder Blast attack from Magnezone should be enough to KO a lot of Pokemon. So I actually really like this combination. I think it makes a lot of sense to me. But again, for the most part, maybe a little bit less consistent with the amount of Pokemon that we have to run in the deck. Most decks right now we're playing Arceus combined with like another card, so to fit in the 6 cards to play Magnezone is just a little bit of a stretch. This deck here, of course, playing 10 Pokemon, and I think that's just a little bit more than what we would want to play in our decks right now. There's just a lot of good supporter cards, and most decks want to play a lot of those supporter cards, so yeah. Oh, we also did see Snorlax here at 51st place, so shout out to Rivates, I'm not sure how to pronounce that name, but 41st place here, did make it into top cut here, and this is Snorlax. So shout out to Snorlax. We also are actually playing Fighting Energies in this deck, and we're using Marshadow, which I actually like as well. But this is going to be that Magnezone Snorlax berry combination. This is actually a somewhat of a meta deck. I don't think that it's like a top deck, but it is somewhat relevant. I put it on my tier list last week, so it is still floating around here, and it is nice to see Snorlax. Can I go back here? Is it going to allow me to go back? It is nice to see Snorlax at least placing in these tournaments, so pretty cool to see. But yeah, okay, and at 59th place, we do see Starmie. I was really high on Starmie for a while here, and if we go down pretty far, we see Leafeon and whatnot. But I was pretty high on Starmie for quite the while. I honestly still think that Starmie is a really, really good card, but that's beside the point. Let's go and check out the metagame tab here, and we'll take a look at the meta share and the percentages and everything, which should be actually really, really interesting. So here we go. Dialga and Arceus still 25% of the meta share. That is a tremendous amount. 350 people playing Dialga and Arceus here at a 48% win share. So the win percent here for Dialga and Arceus has gone down week after week. It is definitely trending downward. Now, we did see it play second and third place of this tournament. It was still the #1 most played deck, but 48% really is quite low, and I would expect people to play less of this deck if we're gonna keep seeing less than 50% win rate for Dialga and Arceus. It's hard for me to really consider it the #1 deck of the current metagame. However, you know, I think that a lot of people are counterplaying that deck, so I think that it is probably overall the strongest deck of the format, but in terms of its placement in the metagame, I think it really is kind of on a downward trend. A big reason for that is the #2 most played deck was Rampardos here with a 12% meta share and a 51% win rate. Again, this deck is specifically played to counter Dialga and Arceus, so it makes sense here that it was the second most played deck, 166 players, and then a pretty big fall off down to a 5% meta share where we see Gallade and Hitmonlee. But one thing is extremely interesting here is that we see a 60% win rate for Gallade of this week's tournament. Now, the big reason for that, I think, is if we look down below Gallade here, we see that Gyarados was the 4th most played deck here with 55 people playing Gyarados. And yes, I think that Gallade with Hitmonlee is a perfect counter to Gyarados, so it kind of makes a lot of sense, right? Hitmonlee super strong against Gyarados, but Gallade is also really strong against Dialga and Arceus. So for Gyarados to see a lot more play this week makes a lot of sense why Gallade had a really, really good week, and we did see a lot of them placing high in the tournament. So kind of makes a lot of sense to me. I'm not surprised that Gallade did so well this week, but I think that it was probably the perfect meta call for this particular week's tournament with the rise of Gyarados, and it's still a very favorable matchup against Dialga. But what's interesting here is that the deck that won here was only 1.4% of the meta share, and it did have a 55% win rate, so that really goes to show how well positioned Aggro Dark and Weavile and Darkrai was of this tournament. So we're going to see probably a massive shift. Arceus and Carnivine here only a 47% win rate, so not as well positioned, but still a pretty relevant deck here. And if we go down, Darkrai and Arceus, these are very small sample sizes, but 55% win rate as well, pretty impressive. And then Executor and Arceus was also about 48%, so nothing too crazy there, but this is 46 and 48, so basically 50%. Again, once we go down to a smaller sample size, the math doesn't necessarily make like too much sense. I wouldn't really spend too much time looking at it. And then Articuno EX, which did get 4th place here, 18 trainer Articuno only had a 48.5% win share, so pretty close to 50-50, so nothing super tremendous. However, one did kind of poke through, and as we see 18 trainer Palkia really struggling this week. I think a lot of people are kind of moving away from the 18 trainer Palkia for a variety of different reasons. I think that people including Mew EX in Dialga and Arceus does really hurt that matchup. I think it's becoming much more common to do that. Gyarados and Gallade as well, pretty strong cards against Palkia. So I think the format is really shifting away from Palkia as a card itself. Even Origin Form Palkia here, 46%. So I think the inclusion of Mew EX, I think the rise of Gyarados and Gallade, a lot of decks are kind of kind of shifting their makeup and their compositions to be a little bit stronger against Palkia, which really was kind of cementing itself as like the 2nd or 3rd strongest card in the game. So very interesting to see that all happen. However, I think that these shifts are leading to Weavile and Darkrai being a little bit more well-positioned as well. So really fun to see. If we go down a bit, we see that Gyarados here at 51%, and then Gallade EX here at 55%, and then Palkia and Manaphy actually, this is a really small sample size, at 60%, that's 29 and 19, so nothing to really put a lot of stock in, but just interesting to take note. And then this Lucario and Rampardos here, 65%, but 30 and 15, this is just another variant of the Rampardos deck, so pretty interesting to see as well. But yeah, so it's fun for me. I would hope that and maybe this will happen, maybe it won't. But my assumption is that I think we're going to see a lot more things evening out at the top of the metagame. I think it's been about 3 weeks now of Arceus and Dialga really dominating in terms of its meta share. It's still at 25%, which is pretty surprising to me, but that downward trend in its win rate is definitely something to take a look at. I would recommend maybe moving off of Dialga and Arceus. However, you got to be careful, because if you move off Dialga and Arceus, if less people are playing this deck, then the fighting decks will become less good. They'll be performing less good. They'll have a lower average win rate, which means less people eventually will play Rampardos and Lucario, which will then, pave the way back for Dialga and Arceus to take flight, right? Which is just an interesting kind of observation, but that is certainly kind of the biggest interaction of this format, is Dialga and Arceus probably being the overall #1 deck, most played deck, but the fighting decks being the #1 counter, so they really are kind of interacting at the top of the metagame. However, I would expect maybe to see a little bit more of a balance here between Rampardos and Gallade. I think a lot of people are kind of on the Rampardos train, but I think that moving off of Rampardos and going more towards Gallade might be a little bit better right now. We'll have to see. Gyarados might see a little bit of a drop-off, but it did have a 50% win rate this tournament, even with all the Gallade, so it is still, I think, the #1 way to play Water if we're not playing 18 trainers, so I think that's really interesting. I think Gyarados kind of emerging as, once again, the best Water-type deck in the format, which is really fun. But I would actually still put a lot of stock in Weavile and Darkrai, and a lot of these aggressive, maybe grass-based Arceus decks that I think are all really good. In fact, Dark-type Arceus here is at 50% as well, so still a #1, or not #1, but a top tier deck in the format right now, I think, which is pretty interesting. And yeah, so I would expect to see things even out just a lot more as time goes on in this format. I think we have probably like 3 weeks more of Triumphant Light metagame, which is going to be really interesting, because I think the progression has been very apparent, but also like it's really interesting to see, because so many of these decks didn't see play in the first couple weeks of the format, and now they're seeing a lot of play, and some of the decks that saw a lot of play early on in the format just aren't seeing any play. So things are evolving, they are changing, and it is really fun to see. But again, I would expect maybe to see a little bit of a drop-off for both Dialga and Arceus and Rampardos. They both performed a little bit subpar this week, and that should hopefully rise things up for Gallade, Gyarados, and then maybe some of these aggressive Dark-type and Arceus decks and Grass-type decks, which I think should probably see more play, because they are very respectful deck lists. So very fun. My tier list, I will be doing a tier list tomorrow. I don't know, because the format's been changing so much. I normally only do like 2 or 3 tier lists per format, and I sort of update them, but I think things are changing so much that I might actually continue to do the tier lists, because I think that there's actually a lot to talk about in terms of what decks are viable, or the most viable, and maybe what decks are less viable as time goes on. So very interesting to see, but nonetheless, guys, that is going to be our meta report for this week. I would love to hear your guys' opinions down below. Again, I apologize for the upload schedule being all over the place. Like I said, I was very sick for a while, and then I was on vacation for a few days. I did pre-record a couple of videos, but for the most part, we should be back to our normal upload schedule. And like I said, at the end of the month, we will be getting ranked modes, so I plan to do a lot of maybe new content towards ranked battles on the channel. That should be fun. Hopefully you guys maybe enjoy that, and hopefully ranked mode is fun. Once we get some more information about it, I'll cover it here on the channel, but I think it could be a massive improvement to Pokemon TCG Pocket. I don't think it's going to replace any of these online tournaments that we cover every week. I think that competing in this setting is still like the #1 way to compete, but ranked battles should be a really fun way to get additional rewards and also have more, I guess, incentive to battle in the game, which I think we don't really have other than these sort of third-party sort of online tournaments, which we cover here on the channel. But either way, guys, let's wrap it up here. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe. Stay tuned for all of my future videos that we're going to be keeping up with the best decks in the game, the best, the best strategies, the best cards, all of that stuff we covered on the channel all the time. Thank you guys for all of the support and the best wishes while I was sick. I really do appreciate it, and I'm just excited to be back and uploading at a little bit more of a regular schedule. So yeah, anyway, guys, peace out. Have a good one. We'll see you guys tomorrow, and yeah, bye.